Happy New Year! Welcome to 2025, and welcome to The Homeless Conservative in 2025. This is a show about principled politics for exhausted citizens. I'm Blake Fisher, I'm your host, and I'm a political junkie so that you don't necessarily have to be. And thank you for joining me. I hope you had a great Christmas, great New Year. Hope you have all your 2025 goals set up and that you don't abandon them in February. I'm really excited about this next year. Last year, I spent a lot of time covering the presidential election for obvious reasons, so I'm ready to look forward and talk about bigger problems that we have to solve as a country. And covering a Trump presidency will probably not be boring either. But before we start looking forward, I thought it would be a really good idea to look back at the election, just maybe one more time. Not that I'll never talk about it again, but thought it would be worth talking about what lessons each party should have learned from their victory or defeat in November. And to do so, I teamed up with Josh Lewis from the Saving Elephants podcast and did a two-part episode. Josh is a fellow Okie, and if you can't tell by the title of his podcast, a similarly situated conservative. Over on his podcast, we talked about the lessons we think Republicans should learn from their victories in November, and here on this episode, we talk about the lessons, and there are many, that Democrats should learn from their losses in November. So down in the show notes, there's a link for the Saving Elephants Part 1 of this conversation. You don't necessarily have to listen to them in order, but we do reference a couple of things and topics during this discussion about Democrats that we talked about in the Republican episode. So it might help to have context for that. So if you go over to the show notes and listen to part 1 and then come back here and listen to this episode, part 2, that's the preferred order to do it in. But if you feel rebellious, listen to this part first. You can do what you want. One quick technical note for those watching on video. I used a new software for recording and had some sync issues, so apologies that our mouse aren't always lined up with the audio during the discussion. I will do better next time, I promise. I know I have friends that are just happy that I have technical problems sometimes. It's true. I do have technical problems despite being the technical friend. So without further ado, here is my part 2 of the conversation with Josh about the lessons we think Democrats should learn from 2024. All right, Josh, thanks for doing part 2 with me, as well as the part 1 that we did on your podcast for Republicans. And now we're talking about Democrats, which in some ways is, I don't know, a more interesting story. It's just that with a loss, there comes a lot more maybe reflection than a win. And so although I think we talked plenty in your episode on Republicans, that I think there are lots of lessons for Republicans to learn. They might not necessarily learn. It might be detrimental to them, but Democrats certainly have to learn some lessons or they continue to have problems. And in your episode, we talked about 2004 being a similar election for Democrats where kind of the sky was falling and they thought, well, what is our future going to look like? And it was, not very long after that, just 4 years later, that Barack Obama takes the White House. So I certainly don't think that Democrats are as doomed as Republicans specifically think they are. I mean, I do think that they're in some bad positions, but I guess starting with just this election, what do you think were the lessons learned by Democrats so far? I realize we're only a month or two out of that. And so, they're not, I'm sure they're still analyzing a lot of stuff, but do you think there are lessons that were learned by Democrats so far that are correct? And do you think there are ones that are incorrect? We've heard this blamed on lots of things. We've heard of wokeness. We've heard it's we didn't go after the working class. It's it's any excuse you want to hear that you've heard by pundits or in writing lately. Do you think certain ones are more correct to you versus ones that you think are just lame excuse making?
What's interesting is when a party loses an election decisively and it has this opportunity for reflection, and I think a lot of this can be engaged in good faith, but there is not one lesson. There are so many versions of Democrats out there saying, here's the lesson we ought to have learned.
Yeah.
Some of them I find very plausible, some of them not so much. I suspect most is presented in good faith, but I also suspect most of those, here are the lessons we have learned, is an effort for that particular Democrat to remold the Democratic Party in the vision that they have in mind.
Yeah, that's very true.
Principle number 1, perhaps, is Bernie Sanders.
Yep.
Not saying the guy's wrong, but he was one of the first to run out there and essentially say, look, the working class has every reason to believe the Democratic Party doesn't have their back. Why would they? This is the lesson we ought to have learned. Well, what do you know? That's what Bernie Sanders would have wanted the Democrats to have learned for the past 40, 50, 60 years. I mean, that's not a shocker. Doesn't mean he's wrong. It just means it makes it a little hard to parse through, okay, is this truly the lesson, if you will? And far be it from me to necessarily say I have the answer for the Democratic Party. I don't want to come offices. I do. I think a lot of times in these conversations, it's far easier to look at. Yeah, that clearly was not the lesson you should have learned.
Yeah.
Like maybe we just need to double down on all this.
But I also think that's valuable. I think that I think even being able to tell them like that's not the lesson, I think is something that they have to be able to do internally. And like I said, I'm not a Democrat, so I don't really care. Although I think it's good if we have two healthy parties. I mean, I think it's better for the Republican parties to have someone that's competitive, just like I think vice versa. But yeah, I think it's pretty. I think your goggles probably help being on the outside in the sense that it's really easy to go, that's clearly not what voters were saying.
Well, and I say that in part because I think one of the dangers, and this will be the same with Republicans too, is that if you win or lose an election, you tend to put narrative around it that makes sense for Team Red or Team Blue, if you will. I mean, how often have we heard the reasons people didn't vote for Obama or voted against Hillary or voted against Kamala Harris had to do with racism or sexism? And, it's one of those, it's a big country. It's a complicated country. I have no doubt those elements exist. But it is unhelpful, I think, to the Democratic Party to try to absorb all that into the narrative, because I think it encourages them to double down on the very things that led them into such trouble in the first place, of trying to dissect all of us into these sort of interest groups to such an extreme that ends up being offensive to the very groups they're trying to cater to. The one that you and I keep evoking Jonah Goldberg's name in a previous conversation. His favorite example is Latinx, of how that is a term that gets you can get you very far, say, in white elite circles, that ironically is highly offensive to the very people you're trying to be inclusive to.
Yep.
Because I'm from Honduras. I'm not just some sort of a monolithic Latinx. Like that doesn't speak to me in any way. And so I say that in terms of if and to the degree the Democrats are going to learn lessons from this, I think that they need to be able to do it in a way that fits with their narratives that maybe you and I aren't comfortable with. It needs to be able to explain things through some sort of a struggle of either class or identity. It needs to be able to explain things through a sense of corporate interests being at war with, say, working class. And I'm not saying that these things are completely untruthful. There's probably truth embedded in them. But I think unless, I would love it if what the Democrats learned is, I guess we need to embrace full-throated traditional conservatism. I don't think that's going to happen. And as you're saying, we're always going to have a sense of a left and right in this country. And I want both of those to be the healthiest versions of themselves, partially because if we had a really healthy left, I think it sort of forces the right to be a bit healthier and vice versa.
Yeah.
But trying to, so I guess I'm trying to break this down in terminology that would make more sense for the Democratic Party, where they don't have to abandon notions of maybe our entire theory about how race, gender, class works is completely wrong, full stop. One of the, I think possibly one of the low-hanging fruits, and I hate to say Bernie Sanders right, but I do think the Democratic Party would be advantaged by giving up on DEI wokeness and moving back to the older model of sort of a class-based approach. I'm not saying I'm for class-based politics.
Right, yeah, and I think that should be the disclaimer on all this. It's like, if you hired either one of us to go help like they're paying us money to tell them what is wrong, what is right, what they need to do. It's not that we agree with it. It's just that we think it would work better electorally for them. And I think you're right.
I mean, all things can be taken to extreme. So obviously this doesn't fully encompass it, but it was a losing issue from the very beginning, arguing about whether or not men should be playing on women's sports.
Yeah.
And usually, I've seen interviews where a pundit could not even say that, who was on the left and was trying to help their own side, because immediately they were attacked for calling these people men.
Yep.
Okay, we could have an honest debate about whether or not they're a man or a woman, but we all know what you mean.
Well,
we understand the argument.
Yeah, or even now, I've noticed that people are like, if they try to hedge and say, biological men, they still get hammered. It's like, you can't mention that they were ever a man before. And you're right. It's like, who was the demographic that they were getting votes by arguing with this? It wasn't. It's the most interesting thing to me on that point specifically was that generally we think of the younger people being more progressive, liberal, and generally they get more conservative as they get older. They get married and have kids and stuff like that. Trump gained 11 points in the 18 to 29 demographic from 2020. Like, Democrats still won the demographic, but they lost 11 percentage points in that demographic. To me, that's the evidence that the DEI, the identity politics, the men and women's sports, all those kind of like issues that were so far down people's radar of what was important to them were not worth the breath that they were spending talking about them. They're signaling to a very small percentage of the population, hey, we're with you. And those, frankly, just don't turn into giant numbers of votes. It didn't.
No, but I think a lot of what that signals, and I agree with that, is that there was such an insular bubble that it was almost impossible for them to imagine, to embrace a narrative beyond just racism and sexism that would have made sense to them.
Yeah.
That's the world. Because look, if I get this idea that you want to be ideologically pure, if you genuinely believe the other side is fascist, and the only explanation for why they're doing what they're doing is some sort of an ism that makes them evil people.
Yeah.
Okay, I get why you don't want to try to reach out to them in some sort of a good faith argument. But you kind of get to that view if you don't know most people outside of your little bubble, because I'm sorry, you and I live in Rachel State, Oklahoma. Most people in this state voted in a way you and I did not approve of. But
correct.
I'm assuming I'm speaking for both of us when I say I don't think they're fascist or racist or sexist. Like, these are my family and friends, and it's not as if when we get together, that's all they want to talk about is how much they hate the minorities or, the opposite gender or something to that degree. There's more going on here. And so I think there's an inability in elite circles to have to be willing and able to kind of step outside of that bubble to recognize that you're in a bubble. And I guess to me that would be the first lesson that ought to be learned, is just a needfulness to reacquaint yourself with what the average Joe actually thinks and the ecosystem and the society they're swimming in. And I don't, and there are some that do genuinely do that, and I don't know how good faith effort it is, but I know individuals such as AOC literally saying, I want to hear from you if you voted for me and Trump. I want to understand you.
Yeah.
I think that is a necessary first step. Not that AOC represents necessarily elite left America,
right,
but I think that sort of ability to be like, look, I'm not saying I'm changing my mind. I just clearly missed something here and I want to understand it. It seems to be very lacking. And part of the reason I think it's lacking is because people genuinely believe there is no valid reason for opposing me other than if you're just an evil person. And so I think it's a combination of you need more curiosity outside of your bubble, and you need to embrace this idea that maybe the people outside my bubble aren't evil, even if I don't agree with them.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's really weird about that is that the campaign for Kamala Harris obviously did not play up her gender or her minority factors. It's like they knew something that wasn't working, and yet everything else they did in the campaign centered around identity politics. It was white men for Kamala Zoom calls.
Yeah.
It was, and so to me, it's really weird that there was a disconnect between, obviously part of the campaign knew that they weren't playing, like Hillary Clinton went all in on the glass ceiling thing, and it didn't work out. And it was, I don't know if that was just a decision or if they had some polling that showed it or whatever, but obviously
it's more like a muscle memory, I think.
Yeah, but it's just so weird that they did none of that with Kamala. In fact, when she was asked point blank in whichever interview was it it was like the first one she did. I guess that was NBC, right? With Lester Holt, I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly. Straight up asked her, like, okay, well, Trump said at this thing that, he wasn't aware you were black. And she just shrugged. She just said, what am I, I don't want to deal with it. I think that's the perfect answer. She didn't go into the identity. She didn't play the victim. She didn't do any of that stuff. I think that was the right path. And yet they somehow didn't see that for the rest of the campaign. They somehow didn't see that because I think you're right. I think it's in some ways getting a little bit, some people are just saying, oh, it's because we went woke. That's the lesson learned. I don't think I think they could have avoided all the woke stuff and this election would have turned out the same way. I think there was a rejection of that, but not to the degree, it wasn't the monocausal explanation for why they lost, the DEI stuff. That stuff was already kind of tapering. We saw We saw some of these universities getting rid of they're getting back to standardized tests like the SAT and ACT, getting people in. We already saw some of these things changing. So it was very clearly that this was a losing battle, and they probably shouldn't have gone with it at all, because to me, that they them commercial just absolutely killed her. And it's like, why, like, her taking that position in 2019 or whenever it was that they asked her, like, would you support federally funded gender transition surgeries for illegal immigrants who are in jail for committing crimes? And she's like, yes. Who did that win you? Did that win you one vote? No, because everyone that already felt that way is definitely voting for a Democrat no matter what. They're never jumping over to Trump. Like, if you're that diehard ideologue, you're not switching parties. It's just not going to happen. So to me, the Democrats, this whole thing is such a story of they were not willing to piss off a small part of their base at the expense of losing working class and people that are more in the middle, sort of independent. And they were just too scared to piss those people off. And I think that that's really, and like that. So that's the woke stuff. That's the DEI stuff. Yeah. But it's also just the unwilling to say, maybe we were wrong about some things, or being able to say Biden was wrong about some things. So it was, I think, kind of a losing strategy.
I think part of what I think of when you say that is much of the Democratic Party has a problem, I think, with the inertia issue here. Both Harris in 2019, I never believed she was as far to the left as she was campaigning.
I agree, because everyone thought that was the lesson learned from 2016 was we should be super progressive like Bernie Sanders. And I think most of them were faking it to some degree.
And she looked to be I don't know, maybe there's another two, but she looked to be the biggest fake of all. And I'm not trying to say that as like just a scorn on her. I just mean she was bad at this whole, here's who I am, this is the authentic me.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. It was never. Now, I never thought she was quite the centrist or moderate she campaigned to be in most recent race. I think she's probably somewhere in between that radical and that centrist.
Yeah.
But I also don't think Joe Biden is nearly as radical as the elements within his administration that he is consistently kowtowing to and has never denounced in any meaningful sense.
Yeah.
And so I think the Democratic Party has kind of this unusual, it's a conundrum because it allows the right to vilify them as if they are these radical woke ideologists that run the nation.
And to be fair, it's because they do, like Biden was kowtowing to those parts of his base and doing things like talking about term limits for the Supreme Court and talking about getting rid of the filibuster and talking about, like, he was talking about radical things. And so, to be fair, I think you're right. I don't think he specifically is as far left as some of the things he was doing, but because he was saying he was, people are just going to believe you.
Well, and so I guess that's where Biden moved further left than he had in his career. I guess Harris moved a little bit back more to the center.
Right.
But both of them are swimming in this ecosystem that is perceived by a large portion of the United States as being hyper wokeist, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so I think where I'm going with that is, and it's not just a focus on Biden and Harris, maybe the entire Democratic Party. I think it is necessary to do certain things if you're trying to signal to your potential constituents, I'm not of this ilk. You have to recognize you're branded with that. Fair or unfair. Politics is not fair. You're branded with that. People get branded with things all the time that they really don't deserve. But there seemed to be just a clumsy inability to recognize, I have to go case in point, and this isn't exactly with being branded with, say, wokeism, but Harris not only did nothing to distance herself from Biden, she almost doubled down on I'll do the same thing. And Harris, I think, was uniquely shackled with it. If anybody's going to be hampered in this election, maybe a different Democrat could have done it differently. It wasn't part of the administration. I don't know. Maybe it would have turned out the same way. But Harris not only needed to say she would have done things different, she needed to make such a stink out of the issue that it would have offended the loyal Biden supporters, and your average American be like, well, she means it. She is willing to burn any bridge. She's willing to destroy her reputation within this White House. I actually believe her. She couldn't, almost anybody else could just go out there and, here's the mistakes Biden made, but she had to convince us.
Yeah.
And it's not fair. It's not fair, but she really did have to convince us that she was going to be nothing like Biden. And I think that that's equally true of many of the Democrats. They have to convince us that they are not part of these circles that we've seen. Some of them are, and what's weird is some of them part of those circles do really well because they appear authentic and they can speak that language, in all honesty. They don't appear to us fake. But I think that's part of the problem. And maybe to a certain degree, the Republicans have a similar issue, but that the Democratic Party has an image out there that it is unable or unwilling to countenance that this is how we appear to the outside world.
Well, that brings up an interesting question that I have, is that do you think Biden gets fairly blamed for the election loss in 2024, or do you think it's like where do you think the blame? I realize, like I said, it's not just Biden, it's not just Democrats, it's not just that Kamala Harris is a bad candidate. It can be all those things. Do you think Biden gets a fair amount of blame for it, though?
From the Democrats?
Or from Democrats or from anyone?
And I think this is something, I'm not mistaken, you and I were talking about the other day. If we're talking about just from Democrats, I think my answer would be, well, it depends on where we're looking at the calendar.
Yeah.
I think there is coming a day, and it could come very quickly, in which the Democrats may be a little too eager to blame Biden for all of this. It's not real popular to say right now, but I think that is coming. Is he, how to put this? Personally, I think Biden is more to blame than Harris for the 24 loss.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think he had the ability to step out gracefully. There were missteps in his administration, and he did things that I was never going to be for.
Right.
But I think he could have done them in ways with a bit more grace and humility and a willingness to accept responsibility that might have cost him less in the eyes of the American public. I don't know. I think example number one is the fact that he just chose to run again, in spite of the fact most of us, for good reason, thought this is not the Biden we voted for. I didn't vote for Joe Biden, but I can understand it. I came close, and had January 6th occurred prior to the November election, I might have actually said, okay, I guess I'll vote for Biden over the guy trying to still an election. But be that as it may, I think he's part of the problem here is, there's that old phrase from despair.com, no single raindrop believes it's responsible for the flood.
Right.
That's true and untrue. Biden is the biggest raindrop, if you will. Yeah. But how much of it was Joe Biden? How much of it was Joe Biden's handlers? How much of it was the inner circle? How much of it was the Democratic Party unwilling to say behind closed doors, quite frankly, because I understand you don't want to say this out in the public. This is a problem. The guy needs to step down. I mean, when it gets to the point that the majority of Democrats said, yes, we don't want him to run again. Publicly would say that in polling, we do not want this guy to run a second term. And
for a long time, too. For a long time. Yeah, going back to 2022, 23.
And I never got the sense it was ever we don't like Joe Biden. I think the problem was he is going to lose. Mm-hmm. I don't see this guy winning. And we didn't know Trump was the nominee at the point most of these people were saying we don't want him running again.
Yeah.
So I think Joe Biden is chiefly responsible. I think Harris maybe comes in second, but it was a group effort.
Right.
The amount of people that, and I've said this throughout most of the Donald Trump presidency. It feels comfortable to rail on the Democrats. I'm not a Democrat. I've never been a Democrat. I'll never be a Democrat. So it's nice. It's easy. It's fun. I guess
it's easy for me.
Got it wrong. Yeah. But I've tried to maintain throughout the entire Trump presidency, and I'll probably have to do it for the next 4 years. But for the grace of God, there go I. This is something the Republican Party is perfectly capable of doing. And we saw this, I guess, with Mitch McConnell. We've seen it with Dianne Feinstein. Who is this lady that they found in a old senile home from Texas Congresswoman?
Yep.
And maybe it's always been this way, and maybe just historical circumstances are such that it's more present or easier for us to notice. I mean, certainly Woodrow Wilson's second term, he was brain dead for a good chunk of it. And they kept that a secret from the nation.
Yeah,
it's
a problem.
These things should not be ideologically driven, should not be partisan driven. This is shameful, and that's why I'm trying to mention both Republicans and Democrats. And there's nuances and differences. I think McConnell is arguably more with it than Dianne Feinstein was. I don't, to the best of my knowledge, he didn't have to give power of attorney to anyone while he's still serving.
Yeah, and he's also one of 100. I mean, that's the other thing is that it doesn't bother me as much with senators and House members because they're one vote out of a big group, whereas the president is the only person we elected. And we don't have a mechanism for.
Yes. I agree with that, but I also think that it's a problem of degree and a problem of kind, but
Yes.
it's a problem full stop that we live in. The politics is such that people think they can get away with this,
and that they
we
defend it when their side does it, but not when the other side does. Like, because
Yes.
Trump could have as big of a decline as Biden did in the next 4 years, and I promise you, will not be calls to invoke the 25th Amendment from Republicans.
No,
It won't happen.
And I think that is also an insulation problem, because I think the people who wanted Dianne Feinstein to keep going was her inner circle.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, Joe Biden probably did what he did for the longest while because of Jill Biden and Hunter
Yes.
Biden and
Yes.
his inner circle. These are individuals who they don't serve the best interest of their party or their nation or their state or jurisdiction. It is about as close as you can get to a corrupt system of we're in this for ourselves. I would even go so far as to say what Jill and Hunter Biden did was of great detriment to to Joe Biden himself.
Yeah.
I would never want relatives to treat me like that if I were in Joe Biden's
Same
position.
thing. Yes.
And so I think there is maybe an unwillingness to encounter not just the Democrats, but the entire nation, that we have a terrible problem, a lack of character in our leadership class, say. I'm not talking about the elected officials necessarily, but those who surround the elected
Yes.
officials who, for whatever reason, seem to think it's okay if they keep something going because it's good for them, and they seem to lack the shame to recognize this is just wrong, and I need to put my country, my party's interest above my own personal ambitions.
Yeah, I think that order is completely flipped for everyone. It's them at the top, and then maybe their party, and then maybe their country. And it's like, it's completely flipped. It should be country, then party, then yourself. And you're right. I just think that is more rare than it was. It's interesting when we talk about Biden, because I think he fairly will get blamed for a lot of this stuff. But I think what Democrats need to be careful about, if you blame Biden, and I do think there's a degree of where Harris, I think the other Democrats that could have thrown their hat in the ring to run, why would they let Kamala Harris be the fall guy and never have to run again? And then you run in 2028. And again, that's politicians putting their interest above their country and their party. If Donald Trump is really the fascist or the danger to the country that you claim he is, then someone like Josh Shapiro, pick your name, Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, pick anyone from a list, Dean Phillips, pick it. If they really thought that he's the threat, but really also knew that Kamala couldn't win, then you're not really putting your country first if you don't throw your hat in the ring. That's my opinion. I just don't. So it's interesting that I think that Biden and Harris deserve blame, because I think they're not good at their jobs. However, the reason Biden was unpopular is because he went along with the Democrats and the far left of his base. That's the reason why Biden wasn't popular. So to me, if Democrats don't look in the mirror and go, wait, but Biden was just enacting all of our dream policies and doing all the things that we told him he had to do, that's where it gets tricky. Biden will be gone. I mean, I would probably bet money that Biden's dead before Trump's term is over. I mean, I don't think it's unrealistic to say that, like, he is aged significantly in the last 10 years. And it's very clear, especially this Wall Street Journal article that came out a couple weeks ago, that kind of detailed some of this was happening during the 2020 election too, the sort of handling of his age and stuff. And certainly into 2021, early in his term, they were saying things like, well, he has good days and bad days. Well, that's a problem for me. But it's that's not the problem. The problem was not just that he was too old. The problem was that he went all in on, he listened to his most liberal staff and progressive staff about, let's forgive student loans. Let's try to get the Green New Deal. And if we can't do that, we'll call it the Inflation Reduction Act. Let's get all cars to be electric. He's doing all these things that are clearly not popular with the public, but they are very popular with the Democrats and the Democratic base. And that's how they think they're going to solve the problems of the world. Mm-hmm. What's interesting to me is that by going back to the Latinx thing or the DEI kind of stuff or any of the kind of identity politics stuff, what's so interesting about that is that clearly that makes you kind of part of the elite that are telling people how they have to speak. You know, if you're in the group that says, oh, this language is in and this language is out, which is very much a left-wing thing. That's college campuses, that's the media, that's Hollywood, that's all these things that are trying to shove the cultural stuff down our throat. that by default makes you one of the elite. And this was so clearly a rejection of that. The populist kind of era we're in is about like going against the elite. How do Democrats think that they can balance those two things? They can't be the elite and pretend that they're not. You got to pick one of those two things. And I think that if I had to guess how this will go down in the future, Democrats will just blame Biden and Harris and shove them to the side, and they won't learn the lessons that, no, it's actually your policies that were very unpopular that made Biden such a disaster and made Kamala Harris such a disaster. They were listening to you all. It's not like they were bucking the trends. They weren't doing what Trump is doing. I think conservatives will have a real opportunity in the future if Trump's second term goes poorly to say, yeah, none of this stuff are conservative principles. Like, we think tariffs are bad. See, we told you they're bad. I think that's more likely to happen. Democrats can't point to anything that Biden did that they disagreed with. And I think that's really where Democrats have to do the soul searching to figure out, it looks like our platform's not popular. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think how how Democrats would respond to that charge. And I do know some of my Democratic friends would be like, look, we pointed to a lot of things that Biden did that we were against. In some cases, he didn't go far enough.
Yes.
I think you can legitimately make the case that he did not go in the Bernie Sanders direction. And if you buy the argument that in 2016, we were sort of shown that was the way to go, certainly that's where the Democrats thought. The problem, I think, with the complexity, I think, there is that it's not necessarily clear in my mind that 2016 proves moving to the left was the wrong move for Democrats. And I don't say this with any glee or, I hope I'm wrong about this. I think the problem was the versions of the left we got, which was, who was I'm blanking on his name, the mayor in the Democratic debate that.
Oh, Pete Buttigieg?
No, it wasn't Buttigieg. It was a Texas.
Oh, yeah. I can't remember his name either.
Well, anyhow, he didn't get much clout, but he made the state like it was in one of those multiple moments where all of the candidates, except for like Biden and I don't know, maybe one or two, maybe Tulsi Gabbard, maybe I want to say Claire McCaskill. Who was the other woman that won that was somewhat
from Minnesota.
Yeah.
I just drew Klobuchar, Amy Klobuchar.
Thank you, Klobuchar. I kept wanting to say McCaskill. I was in Missouri. Anyhow, there were exceptions. I'm not trying to paint them all with this broad brush, but that they kept tripping over each other, trying to, every time somebody would say something of the left, they try to push it even further. And one of them blurted out something about, well, we're not talking about the dangers of birth control issues for transgendered women, or something like that. Or the way he said it was like, wait, did he just imply biological men
need birth control?
We're not talking about their what? And it took there was a solid 30 seconds where I was the gymnastics in my head, I was trying to work out what does that even mean? And by then they went to commercial break. So anyhow, the reason I bring all this up is that is a very different leftism than necessarily what I think a Bernie Sanders type offers.
Yeah.
Because we have seen versions of this. Now, maybe you can't really truly do this homegrown in the United States, but, to certain degrees, there are variations of this. FDR was popular. Woodrow Wilson, to a certain degree, was popular. There are many of my friends on the left who will say, look, what we have not seen, and this is probably true, is a true populace of that ilk that is for the working class. Maybe they're not full-throated socialists. Maybe they're not Marxist-Leninists, but they speak that language. And while I do agree with you that you have to pick one, you can't be both a populist and part of the elite. The irony here is I think one of the great contradictions that runs through the heart of much of the left is it is this bizarre marriage between the technocrats trying to run everything and the voice of the people. Yeah. Right? It's what is their solution to almost every problem? It's like, well, give us the power. We'll point the correct people to this problem, and then they'll fix it for us. While we're speaking about being anti-corporation and anti-big business because we're for the people. Yeah, there's an inherent contradiction there. I'm not saying that it's that you can't find ways to smooth it over, but that's the successful people on the left. FDR, for instance, that's what they do. They find a way to speak to the yokels, while appointing the elites. I think there is a way to put these things together. I think part of the way to put it together, though, is you've got to have people that are genuinely know how to speak to the yokels.
And they've got to be competent. You've got to hire competent people, too. And I just think that Biden did Democrats have done neither one of those things. Like,
no, they haven't. And it's not I think the problem here, Blake, is probably because you and I agree more on policy positions than we would with our friends on the left. It's easier for us to say, look, the problem is that the policies are just unpopular because they don't work. Yeah, that's true to a degree. But sometimes you can look, FDR, in my view, his policies did not work, and yet he is revered among the Democratic Party. Part of it is the history around what came before it. Part of it is the lore that built up around it. Part of it is the World War II that we fought. Part of it is there was a perception of, okay, well, at least I'm being helped. And you can have it's kind of bizarre. It's almost the opposite effect in the Biden administration. The United States under FDR recovered slower in the Great Depression than most developed countries. In the United States, our inflation was actually not as bad as most developed countries. Yeah. And yet Biden gets blamed for it. You've heard me say this before. I'm not as big on blaming Biden for inflation, even though I'm very critical of his economic policies. In the same sense, sometimes things are just completely outside of both parties' control, but you can have a populist figure that, for whatever reason, the population attributes all these good things to and ignores the problems around them.
Right.
Some of it's a messaging issue, but I think a lot of it is just that the inability of people to communicate like they understand how normal people live.
Right. And I think that's the problem. That's the disconnect, is that Democrats, especially on the coast, do not understand. They literally don't know a Republican. They don't know someone that drives a truck. They literally take public transportation. Like, they don't understand how most of the country even lives, even just right outside of Washington or whatever. And I think what's weird about that is that FDR is a good example. I agree. I think that we were in the Depression for longer than we would have been had we not done all the New Deal stuff. I think that the difference was people had jobs and people saw buildings being built. Biden likes to pretend like, oh, we passed this thing. How many electric chargers they built, or how many rural people have broadband now, even though we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars. Like, we've got nothing to show for it. So it's not, it's like you're trying to pretend that, oh, like, we're the technocrats, we're in charge. But then people are going, yeah, I still don't have broadband internet. So that didn't work. I don't see any electric chargers. And even if I did, I kind of like my vehicle. So the problem was they were trying to be elite and say they're technocratic, but they're not good at being technocratic. I think there is a lot of leeway for the populism thing if you put people in government. And I don't like this. I would rather have smaller government. And I think the nature of government being big it's bad at things. It's not as good as the private sector. It's just not as good as the market is. That's my core principle as a conservative. I understand why people might not have that same idea, but they at least want to see results. And if they're not seeing results from, like I said, look at everything. Look at the infrastructure bill. Look at the Inflation Reduction Act. It didn't decrease inflation. Prices are like, they're not explaining well enough what these things are supposed to do, and they're not competent enough. And so, yeah, you're gonna get rejected at some point. But then it's about, what do you do going forward? And it's like, what do the Democrats do? They go all in on populism? I think that's hard for them because they are so encompassing the elite crowd. So college-educated voters went overwhelmingly for Democrats. There's a split between college-educated and non-college educated. There's the split between, like, they have all the commanding heights of cultures. They control Hollywood. They control the media. They control the college campuses. They control all of the elite institutions that we think about. Democrats control. It's really hard to be populist and say those things are bad, or like, oh, we're against those people, when they are those people. I think people see right through it. And so maybe that is the lesson they need to learn, but they'd have to restructure a lot about how the party functions right now. And so I don't think that's super realistic. I mean, I do think Bernie Sanders, you're right, had an outsized influence on kind of the direction of the party after 2016. Not in the way that people were paying, like, it's not like he had a pedestal. It's like people thought, oh, well, he did better than we thought he would. Yeah. And therefore and keep in mind, this is all based on him still losing to Hillary Clinton and then her losing the election. So you lost to the loser. Mm-hmm. I don't think you're as popular as people claim that he is. I think that for the most part, people are attracted to his authenticity, which is why I think people are attracted to Trump too. I think people go, that guy is, I don't want to say shooting me straight, because I think they both actually are wrong about a lot of stuff. But I think everyone believes that they're saying what they truly believe, if that makes sense. And so I think they like that in politicians. I think that's the lesson that should have been learned, and not that, oh, because Bernie Sanders is a progressive, we should go all in on that. I mean, I think that maybe there's some of that stuff that does have more traction with voters than other things, but I think this past November was more of a statement of, and by the way, 2020 before that and 2016 before that was a referendum on the way government was functioning at that time. And I think people have overwhelmingly said now for 3 elections in a row, we don't think government is working functionally like the way we want it to. And we would just like you to do the jobs that you're supposed to do. Congress should pass budgets. The Defense Department should should defend us. And like, we want these things to function the way they're supposed to function. And I think everyone that has to deal with the government in any sort of way, which is almost all of us, have determined that that is not happening. And so I just don't see how the Democrats could be the big government party and the populist party while simultaneously not getting stuff done in government. I think that I don't see how any 3 of those, like not even one of those pieces makes sense to me. And so where do you think, like, what do you think if you were paid, and I know this is a weird thought experiment for us to do as conservatives, but you're paid as a consultant to come into the Democratic Party and say, like, how do we right this ship? And let's pretend for the moment. I mean, although I don't think it's off the table to say that you guys need to be more conservative, because I think you look at the convention and it looked like a Republican convention. I mean, they were waving flags, and this like America sucks stuff was just gone from, like, they didn't allow the pro-Palestinian crowd come in there to be anti-Semitic and stuff. So maybe it's fair that you can tell them that you need to be more conservative. Although I don't necessarily, conservative is a weird word right now, because what does it mean? Because I don't think Trump is conservative, but some would say that he leans that way. But if you're paid to come in and consult and say, here's the lesson you need to learn, here's what you need to do going forward, do you have any idea what you would tell them?
Yeah, but not much of one. I mean, I have a lot of things I'd tell. As we're kind of talking earlier, it is far easier to say, here are the things I would immediately stop doing, than necessarily hear the things you
but they might need to hear those things.
They might need to hear those things. But let me just, for the sake of the question you asked, try to focus on what to do, not necessarily what not to do. I think, and embedded in your question was, or when you were speaking there, you and I have both had Brett Lloyd on with the
Independent Center.
The Independent Center, thank you. Now, Brett, I think, is a very sharp guy. I spoke with a couple of people at the Independent Center. I like what they're doing. I am not necessarily completely sold on their messaging or on their take. I think they tend to be a little bit more libertarian for my taste. It's fine. I think we need more libertarians in government. Yeah. I think they also tend to possibly overread what it means that Americans are becoming more and more independent. But I think that's totally fair. I think that's fair. Yeah, I think they are correct. Americans are becoming more and more independent. I think there is a reason people voted for both AOC and Donald Trump. I think there's a reason some of those same people voted for both Barack Obama and Donald Trump. Or that 4 states voted for Trump at the top of the ticket, and then Democratic senators. Like, we're getting some ticket splitting going on. Right. And so I think there is we hear this word a lot, that authenticity is what we perceive as lacking in our elected officials. What is the old phrase? I can't remember if it may be apocryphal, but whoever said, the key to politics is being authentic. Once you can fake that, you've got it. Yeah. There are some that I dare say, I don't think Trump fakes authenticity, but I also don't think he's a truthful person. Right. But he is not a truthful person. Have you heard that? I can't remember who has developed this theory that there's a big difference between a liar and a BSer. Like, Americans we're fine with BSers, people that just sort of like willy-nilly say, like, Clinton in a sense could be in that camp. It's the guy at the Free Press did a thing on Eli Lake. Yes, thank you. Yeah. And so I'm and I'm trying to use the PG terminology. Yeah, the BSer. Yeah. No, it's very interesting, because you're right. It's a little different than lying. It's kind of like, it is. There's a little bit of that goes along with politics kind of all the time. But yeah. Yes, and I think it's I think the irony is our politicians try to present themselves as being pure and clean as the wind-driven snow, and instead come across as just complete sleazeballs. Yes. And as weirdly, it's those that sort of double down. Bill Clinton was a sexual predator, and yet everybody was agreed, I'd kind of like to have a beer with the guy.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and so there's some of it is gravitas. You know, some of it is just innate. I don't have it. I'm not entirely certain how you get it. I'm sure I could hone some of those skills. Some of it is that, but I think some of it is also a universal rejection of the Democrat, Republican, I'll call it baby boomer cultural back and forth. And I say this all the time on my podcast, that two of the most popular figures on the left and the right among people our age and younger, or at least when we were younger, was Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders. There's nothing about them demographically that screams young, diverse American. You know, we were supposed to be taken away with Pete Buttigieg. That was the guy we were supposed to fall in love with because he's a homosexual. He speaks eloquently. He's young. Most of the people on the left hated the guy. They thought he was part of the same system that has been the problem. And so
and I don't believe he's the future of the party like a lot of Democrats do. I don't see it. I think that I think he screams the elite thing that is hurting them. It's not that I think he's untalented or something. I just don't think he has the factor that they need. And that's the first thing I would tell them is, like, you need to run away from the sort of professional class. That's not the person that's going to save you from this, in my opinion. In fact, I think Joe Biden was the right choice in 2020. That's what's weird, is that I have this weird juxtaposition of, I'm with you. I would have voted for him because I thought Trump was kind of a disaster. But the fact that he brought on Kamala Harris as the VP, to me, was the signal that he was not taking this seriously, because she is not ready for the job. And when people's biggest concern about you is your age, and you pick someone like that's that inexperienced to be a heartbeat away from the presidency, to me, it just spoke like, okay, he's not serious. It wasn't just that I didn't like her. It was that, to me, that was an unserious choice, and it was caving to a part of the base that didn't make a lot of sense to me just because of her race and her gender. And I just thought that was a really bad pick. He could have gone with Cory Booker, for example, and I would have said,
right,
that's a better option than, he at least checks off some of those boxes for him. But it's like, okay, he's been a senator for longer. I think he's more serious. I think he actually has his own thoughts. But to me, that's the difference. And so I don't see how I agree. I would say stay away from Pete Buttigieg, stay away from that kind of crew if you want to succeed going forward.
And I think, elections, sooner or later, both parties get tired of losing. Sooner or later, individuals do find a way to hone in on a message that works. Maybe Pete Buttigieg is the future of the Democratic Party. Maybe he will find a way to craft his particular brand in such a way that has some salience to Americans. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not going to rule that out.
I don't think he has it right this moment. Yeah.
Right. At this particular moment, the Pete Buttigieg, it's not him specifically, but he represents the very thing that I think the Democratic Party would be foolish to double down on.
Yeah.
There may be ways to do it. I'm not just ruling that out. But I also, and just as a brief aside, part of my problem with Biden picking Harris was not so much he picked it. I mean, I was never going to be happy with whoever he picked. My bigger problem with it, though, was that he pre-announces it's a woman and it's going to be a woman of color.
Yeah.
It's like, that harms her. It harms you. It gives credence to this argument. Well, she's just some sort of a diversity.
Because you announced that it's a diversity hire.
Right.
I mean, you told us it was going to be.
You can pick her. Why tell us ahead of time? That's the
agree.
reason I'm doing it. Like that just seemed like such an unforced error. So much of the Biden administration was an unforced error.
Yeah.
I think. But anyhow, I'm. If you're paying me to try to advise them, not that anybody's listening to my advice, I guess that would be the first, is finding those individuals who can hone that sort of authenticity that keeps within your, their authentic voices that may be completely antithetical to what the Democratic Party wants to do. There are plenty who do subscribe to what the Democratic Party wants to do. One of the things that I find very interesting, though, and this is maybe, I don't want to get too far off out here in left field, is why is it the American people are so desperate for authenticity? Because from a very, 1,000-point view, you could easily think of people who are authentic who would make the worst conceivable leaders you could have.
Yes.
That one single quality, why is it that we're so desperate for it? And I think it speaks to this moment that we have completely lost trust in institutions and their ability to do anything good for us. And that somehow when somebody's authentic, even when they're saying things that maybe in our better self, we would say, That's stupid. That's terrible. That's a bad thing to pursue. We're endeared to that because it's such a rarity, if you will. They seem human in a way that the system does not.
Yeah, I think it's not just the authenticity that I think they're attracted to. I think that there's kind of an anarchy to some degree of Trump and Bernie Sanders that I think people were attracted to. So it wasn't just the authenticity, but it was more of like hey, this system is not working. So it's that combination of those two things. I think you're right. Someone just being authentic, I don't think necessarily will make them a even good politician or necessarily win them an election. I just think that when we're faced with two choices and one seems like they're lying to us or pretending to be someone they're not and the other one isn't, I think people tend to trust the person that seems more authentic. Mm-hmm. I think we don't have enough experiments lately to see, for example, like Republican primary, I would argue Chris Christie was the most authentic person on stage, as far as he just, obviously it's a weird example because none of those people had a chance. It was going to be Trump's once the lawfare kind of started and stuff. But my point is, like, I don't think it always totally works. I think you also have to have some sort of message that is landing with people. So yeah, I would say those are the two things. I'd be like, you need to find someone that's authentic and isn't you're not trying to be the flavor of the week, or they're not looking at polls necessarily, but they also need to have a message. They need to be able to communicate something. I think Bernie Sanders did that better than Trump did. I think Trump was more of a feeling. Like some of the stuff he was saying made some sense to people, but a lot of it was more of a feeling. It was like, this isn't working and we're tired of this. And it was an exhaustion and people were fed up with the government. I think that he sort of tapped into the Tea Party stuff, but without the structure of it. Not that there was a lot of structure in the Tea Party, but even like,
I think it turned out the Tea Party was far more about a feeling than anything else than I had given it credit for.
Although I think with the right leader, it could have been great. Yeah. You know what I mean? I think with the right person at the helm of that. And so I think that's what I would say. I was like, look, people are still really unhappy. And I think that people will be really unhappy in the near future with the Trump administration too. I just think that that's more likely to happen than not. I would say if I had to plan for Democrats right now, you're not going to go into 2026 with Trump just like killing it on everything. You know what I mean? I don't see that being realistic, mostly because I think people have unrealistic expectations of what government can accomplish. And so until someone comes in and says, that's not our job, or that shouldn't be something we do, I think we're going to keep kicking this ball back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. And so I'd be like, if you guys want to have a winning coalition, you need to like do the stuff that's less popular inside of politics. You need to prove that you can govern well. I mean, that's the first thing I would do is probably go to like mayors and governors that are blue. And I would say, you can't have our cities. We can't have our blue cities being the night. Like we can't have Chicago have the murder rate it has. We can't have New York have the crime wave it has. We can't have DC arresting people and just releasing people. Like these are things that we have to change. And like we are getting the blame for this as a party. And I would start with those things that are so clearly issues that people are fed up with. They don't like crime rising. They want the government to protect people. They want the government to do the things they've said they're going to do. They want them to cut that Social Security check because they said they're going to. They want them to pick any issue. And I think that people, if you can package that together, you've got a winning thing. But I would certainly stray from the sort of elite thing. I would not. I think Josh Shapiro is a better method to go than Gavin Newsom. I think Gavin Newsom just sort of, maybe it's even just the way he dresses and looks. I just think that people think he's kind of a snake. Even Democrats, I think, kind of go like, yeah, he feels like a politician.
And some of that's probably not his fault, but he does look like an elite snob.
He looks, and he is an elite snob. I mean, that's the other problem.
Sure.
He's authentically an elite snob. And I also think that someone needs to embrace that too. Cause like we're going to have elites and it drives me crazy that everyone pretends they're not elite when they're talking about the elites, like Ted Cruz, for example. It's like, dude, you're a 3-term United States senator. Your wife is on what? Like she's incredible at Goldman Sachs. I mean, it's like, you are the elite. You went to Harvard Law School. You are elite. You need to own it and then say, how does my position help people that aren't? And I think everyone's just pretending they're not elite. And I think that's the dumbest way to try to be authentic, because I think people see right through it. Donald Trump owns the fact that he's a billionaire. He's never once pretended he's not the elite. You'll never hear him say, like, oh, those rich bastards. I mean, like, it's like he doesn't do it because he is one of them and he wants to be in that crowd. Democrats can't find that balance, though. They've not found, like, I mean, they like their billionaires, but they don't like to talk about it. And I think that's...
By the way, did you notice, I don't remember what year it was, where people started to track when Bernie Sanders would rail against, he used to say millionaires and billionaires, now he only says billionaires?
Because he's a millionaire.
He is now a millionaire.
Everyone's idea of the elite is right above the pay grade that they make. I mean, essentially,
Right.
that's what it is. People in Congress think it's the people slightly richer than them. Once you're a millionaire, you think it's billionaires or 10 millionaires or 100 millionaires or whatever. It's always a step above you. There's always someone to vilify you above you, unless you're Elon Musk. He's the only person in the world that doesn't have someone that he can't vilify based on some sort of elite status or financial kind of thing. I think you're right. I think the class thing is smarter for Democrats to go for than the identity stuff. I think clearly 2024 was a rejection of that, especially with Latino voters, because they are not the same. People from Puerto Rico and from Guatemala and from Mexico, and just because they speak the same language, they have almost nothing else in common. And the fact that Democrats keep trying to lump them into one group of people, I think pisses them off. And I think that it is foolish for them to talk to them like this one big group. And I think it was foolish for Biden to think that, like, if I just opened the border, this is going to be good for Democrats. It was pretty clear that Latino voters didn't like that, basically at similar numbers to the rest of the country. It was not a popular position. I think it's really foolish the way Democrats look at someone's skin color, gender, or where they're from and think that is going, where they're from is actually different, but I mean, like, immigration wise, like, and think that is the defining characteristic that gets those people on their side. I think that they've taken that for granted. And I don't know that these trends that we saw in this election are a blip. We will see as 2026 and 2028 come. I don't think the Latino stuff is. That's been kind of a trend for years. Yeah. I think I think it would be a really good thing if we didn't think of them as a group of voters. I think that it's not smart politics. It'll be very hard for Democrats to ditch the identity politics, though, especially because there's a misconception on the right that wokeism was rampant under Joe Biden. It was rampant under Trump because it was a reaction to Trump. Like, the wokeism stuff was, and I think that has more, I think we will see an increase in the woke stuff in Trump's second term, because Democrats love to be the sort of protesters. They love to pretend that they're like always the, I don't know, the sort of hippies on the edge that are like speaking truth to power or whatever. And they're just not. They are the people controlling this stuff. They are the elites. I think that's what makes it so inauthentic. I think that's the really bad combination for them, is that they are the elite pretending they're not, and it just doesn't work. I don't know. Do you think it makes sense?
Yeah, I think so. And it's kind of an interesting thought experiment, because you're right. There's a lot on the cultural left that makes sense as the hippie railing against the system. Yeah. So what do you do when they are the system? You have to pretend like you're not. And it's kind of bizarre, because now we have a lot on the cultural right that pretends as if it's the victim, and we're both kind of tripping over each other, explaining, hey, you're the one in charge. No, you're the one in charge. Yeah,
everyone loves to be the victim. Everyone loves to actually be the one out of power, because they can pretend they're fighting. Yeah. Whereas once they have to govern, they don't like to do that.
And that's something that Yuval Levin talks about, is that we have this misconception of both parties that when you win an election, it means you've won. He says, no. When you win an election, what that actually means is the American people have now given you an opportunity to demonstrate whether or not your ideas work. Yeah. That's the real test. It's not winning the election, it's governing. Yes. And it's odd the degree to which both parties want to skip that step and just focus on the winning. I did want to quickly mention, too, because I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up. There are other elements, as you and I were talking earlier, abortion did not nearly seem to be as big of an issue in this election as we thought it might, much to the Democratic Party's chagrin. Yep. Neither did this notion of saving democracy. Yeah. And I think that's an interesting concept. We could do a whole other hour on this, so I'll just try to touch this very briefly. I was listening to Al Franken's podcast recently, where Franken's a decently intelligent person, so I don't know if he was doing this to sound ignorant, or maybe he genuinely didn't know, but he was talking about what a shocker it was to him that all these polling would come out about the percentage of Americans who said, yes, they're concerned about democracy. And he would say, great, that's a Harris vote. that means that, X percentage of Americans are concerned about Donald Trump because he's a threat to democracy. And it supposedly, according to him, it was such a revelation. Like, he was presenting this to the audience as if he was learning something new that nobody else would have thought of for the first time, that no, not every American that says they're concerned about a threat to democracy was concerned about Donald Trump. Some of them were concerned about the Democrats.
Right.
And I think that, and I want to be crystal clear on this, and I think you and I are similar in this. What Trump did on January 6th, and quite frankly, in the lead up to that, the 4 years, even in the 2016 debate with Hillary Clinton, where he straight up says, I will keep you in suspense on the night of the results of the election. Yeah. And it's consistent drumbeat that this is unfair, that they're rigging the system. This is who Trump always was. And the moment he had the opportunity to try to steal an election, he tried to. I don't want in any way to equate that to what many of the Democrats have done, at least at a presidential election. There are certainly some at the lower levels who have done even more despicable things than what Trump did. Yeah. So I don't mean this as like a moral comparative, but the complete inability and unwillingness of the Democratic Party to look themselves in the mirror and say, it's not true that we wear all the white hats and they wear all the black hats. Yeah. It is in fact the case that in the midterms of 2022, I guess, they were funding super MAGA candidates because they thought they would be more easily beatable. Right. It is still true that they were doing so many things that you would think, if you really think Trump is Hitler, you'd think you would sacrifice a little bit to try to build a bigger coalition to defeat this guy. Right. And either they were not honest with themselves or the public, either they were lying to us about that, or worse still, they actually believed that and they were just so cynical about their own personal political ambitions. It kind of became this, and I'm not even getting into to what degree was lawfare a part of it. Right. Should have. It's a complicated issue. Part of the things I think Trump's guilty of. But neither of those answers make voters feel good. Like, no, they don't. You know what I mean? And so I think a voter could understandably be like, look, I don't like what Trump did, but I don't trust you, Democrats. I don't think you are the pure party here. I think your record is almost just as questionable as much as the Republicans. And so I say all that to say that, this is something I circled back to earlier. I desperately want people to think of their country first. Yeah. I know that sounds naive, but it's true. We desperately need more than anything for people to say, what's most important is the integrity of these institutions and this electoral process, not who got their tax policy through over this, or whose immigration policy won out over this 2 to 4 year period. And I do not see that either party is producing people of that character and that honor. And to me, that is shameful, and it is sad, and it is scary. Yeah. And to me, you take all that, because I think there's, again, a million lessons they could learn. I think they could, the fact that anyone is writing an article right now talking about Kamala Harris's future in the party is hilarious to me. I'm like, dude, she's not good at this. And I'm not saying she's solely to blame for the loss, but she's clearly not the kind of candidate that could, if we think there's a media shift, for example, like podcasts, is that really is the legacy media's influence on elections dying? Well, if that's the case, you have to have a candidate that can go on podcasts and talk for 2 hours to someone and not sound like a politician. And Kamala Harris can't do that. And that's the reason she doesn't have a future in the party, I think. And so if I were consulting Democrats, I think the two things I would say that in no way go against my principles, I would just say, you can't have a candidate that can't get on a podcast and talk for 2 hours. You just can't do it going forward. And the problem is not that you don't have the podcast. The problem is that you don't have the talent to go on an adversarial podcast and be able to hold their ground. That's really the problem. And then the second thing I would say to both parties, but especially Democrats, you've got to own your mistakes. I think this was such a rejection of Biden and Harris. And if Harris would have even done a little bit of trying to push Biden under the bus for some of the things that they did wrong, even if you just want to look at it in a hindsight way. Look, in hindsight, obviously, we would have rather the Afghanistan withdrawal been different, and maybe we should have done things differently. With the information we had at the time, we think we made the best decision. But looking back, they're not even doing that level of, hey, maybe we were wrong about something. And I think that's the first thing voters are going to need is just an acknowledgement that they did mess some stuff up. They did cause some bad inflation. They did spend a bunch of money that's going to cause more problems. They did prioritize student loan forgiveness for a very small part of the country that's their constituency. And
to the detriment of the rest of the country. They've got to own some of the stuff that was very unpopular and got them, like I said, lost them houses in 2022 potentially, although not to the degree that they thought it would, and then lost them everything in 2024. They lost every swing state. They 53 seats in the Senate, and what is going to be a 2-seat majority for a few months while in the House. But
as of the time of this recording,
the point is you lost across the board, and to me, you've got to own that first and say, why did we lose? You can't just look at it as a fluke Republican win. When Donald Trump won a second term, non-consecutive, it's only happened one other time. I would argue his favorability actually went up for the first time ever in this last year. And to me, that's the Democrats doing something wrong, not necessarily the Republicans doing something right. And I don't see how they can go forward without at least admitting those things. And so that would be step one for me. I think if they don't do that, they have no chance other than counting on Republicans to screw up. And I just don't think that's a way to actually run a party or to have power. Is like, I think you have to they have to decide who they are. And that's okay. You can have a broad coalition. You can have Bernie Sanders in your group, and you can have AOCs, and you can have Amy Klobuchar's and Dean Phillips and these people that are definitely more moderate, not on the progressive wing. You can build a broad coalition, but you have to have some things that we say, hey, these are what define Democrats. I think that stuff's gone way too far, out of touch with where most American voters are. I don't think most voters care about identity politics. I don't think most voters care about transgender stuff. I don't think it's clear they don't care about foreign policy. They don't care about abortion that much. There's all these things that are these pillars of the Democratic Party that they are just not resonating with voters, and they've got to shift that. And there's always shifts in parties. This happens for the entirety of the country, the whole history of the country. We've had these slow shifts. Like, just because someone was a Republican in 1910 does not mean that they would have been a Republican in 1920 or 30 or 40 or 50 and then fast forward to 2024, I would say both parties would be unrecognizable to someone from the 90s, when Bill Clinton, you're right, was around and stuff. Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned Bill Clinton, though, because I think Bill Clinton is a better analog to Donald Trump than anything else. I mean, in the sense that, like, Donald Trump's campaign was kind of Clinton's campaign in 92.
Multiple levels.
On a lot of different levels. And so, but I think the problem is that Democrats are going, or at least what I've seen right now is they're going, oh, we need our own Joe Rogan. We need our own, and they're trying to just like imitate what someone else had success with doing. And maybe there's a path there or something. I just think that will get them into an authenticity problem, because it won't very likely be authentic if they think that they can throw, because what it normally would be is like someone decides, oh, that's how I'm going to be now, and they start acting like that. They need to find that person that is genuine. And like I said, I'm with you. I'm not a Democrat. I disagree with them more than I did a decade ago on almost things, because I think that they have lurched too far to the left, where I think not only are they bad policies, they're like things that no one cares about. So it's a really bad combination of no one wants this policy and it's bad. So I don't cry tears for them having the struggles that they're having right now, but I also know that it's bad for the country overall. And that's what I care more about. And I would rather have these fights in Congress. I'd rather see like AOC and I'd rather see, let's see, Ted Cruz and AOC have a debate. I'd rather watch them actually argue about policy. And who can convince me? That's just not what we're doing. We're just having this kind of, like we're talking at each other, but we're not actually discussing anything or arguing and stuff. I would hope that would be the change that they make, is like, we're going to actually talk about these issues. That's probably too optimistic, though.
Yeah, I think the best we could hope for is once every 4 years we might get a vice presidential debate that's worth watching.
Well, that's all we got this time was a vice presidential debate that was like kind of refreshing and kind of felt old. And like, I'll leave on this note because I think it's interesting. I was at like a neighborhood Christmas party a couple weeks ago, and I ended up talking with two very young, like 22 and 25-year-old girls, and as we're talking about politics and stuff, because they brought it up and all this stuff. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, wait a minute. If you're 22, you've literally never known politics without Donald Trump in it. So, I mean, if you're in that 18 to 29 crowd, you literally, all you've ever paid attention to for your adult life included Donald Trump being in politics. And I think we have a really warped view of what politics is because of that, if you're under the age of 30. And I think even if you're our age, like, 40-ish or whatever, I think
heck, you and I didn't know what what a world without Bill Clinton was.
Right. And so there's this weird thing where this is the political climate, but I think there's quite a few voters that don't know what they don't have. And I think when they see something like refreshing, they would go, oh my gosh, I didn't know it could be like that. So I that would be my hope. And obviously Democrats need to do some work on young voters because they lost a significant chunk of them in 2024. I mean, they still won that demographic, but they lost by 11. I mean, Donald Trump gained 11 points on them. And that's traditionally been such just a giant pillar of the Democratic base is young voters when they can get them to turn out. That would be the most concerning thing for me is that they have to figure out the young voter thing and they got to figure out the working class thing. If they cannot figure out those two things, their coalition of Hollywood celebrities and the institutions of college campuses and the media, there are not enough people in those groups to make up a majority. Like, if that's who you're counting on, you will lose. So you've got to look at working class. You have to look at young voters. You have to talk about these issues that people actually care about, and they all care about their wallets. They all care about the economy. If they can't figure out how to talk to that, I don't see how they bounce back. Any final thoughts from you, Josh? Tell us how people can find you. Obviously, if you got this far and you didn't listen to the first part that was on Josh's podcast, you should do that still. So it's in the show notes. But where else can they find you? How would you like them to pay attention?
I appreciate it. I never know how to answer the final thoughts question, so I'll just go straight to the shameless plugging.
Yeah, that's fine. Go to shameless plugs.
The website, savingelefantsblog.com. One of these days I will win my war with the good people trying to save actual elephants, and I'll just get the savingelephants.com. But it's savingelefantsblog.com. But if you're just doing a search feature within a podcast search engine of some sort, you could probably just find me with Saving Elephants.
And obviously the links will be in the show notes too, so you can find it there to his feed. Josh, thanks for doing this. This has been fun doing sort of post-mortem. Obviously there's a million other directions we could go with this. And there's a lot for both parties to, I think of. I think the biggest danger is that they will both learn the wrong lessons, and we will continue this silliness for a while.
Well, if they do it, it will at least be entertaining.
Yes, if nothing else, it will give us plenty to talk about on our respective podcasts. So at least we have that. I don't think it will get boring for the next several years. All right. Well, thanks a lot for being here, Josh. Appreciate you doing it.
All right. Good to talk to you.
All right, thanks again for joining me and Josh for this two-part episode. I really hope you enjoyed this crossover sort of episode. If you can do one thing for me, please rate the podcast wherever you listen. And if you can do two things for me, share it or any of my short content on Instagram or YouTube with someone you think might find value in it. It really does help me a lot. That's how you spread the word. That's how we grow this audience. That's how I continue to do this. So also give Saving Elephants a follow. Josh gets into the weeds of conservatism in a great way. And if you feel politically homeless to some degree, which I assume you do if you're listening to this podcast, you'll feel right at home over there as well. Again, I hope your 2025 is off to a great start. I hope you'll continue to join me this year as I try to cover conservative politics in a way that you'll find value in. So see you next week.